Well, fantastic. Hello, everybody. I think that we are able to start because so many of you have been so punctual. So welcome to our new session of our workshops on punishment across borders. We are very happy that we will have today with us to present Alice Ievins, who is today a lecturer in criminology at the University of Liverpool. She had done her PhD at the University of Cambridge, where she studied the relationship between sex offenders and contemporary prisons. And her presentation today is about this topic, around which she has recently published a very interesting book. So we are very happy of having Alice with us. She will speak as we usually do it, for half an hour or something like that, and then we will have another half an hour for Q&A. So Alice, many thanks for accepting the invitation. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, yes. So thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for coming. So what I want to do in the talk today is, rather than just go over research I've done in the past, although I will be talking a bit about empirical work that I have previously done, I also want to use this opportunity to make a case that sociologists of punishment should pay explicit and deliberate attention to the punishment of sexual offending. And they should do this and incorporate this into their analysis, both because I think the punishment of sexual offending is a driver of penal change, and also because I think it's an interesting kind of ideal type of punishment, which is revealing of some of its significant dynamics. So I think it's interesting for what it tells us about punishment more broadly. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is firstly just kind of set out my argument for why I think this is an interesting topic for sociologists of punishment. Then I'm going to talk about some of the findings of a study that I've been involved in, which involved the comparative study of the punishment of sexual offending. That was work done in England and Wales and in Norway. And then I'm going to end with some suggestions and questions, which I think, and kind of questions which I think sociologists of punishment could hopefully take forward. Okay. Ooh, struggling to, there we go. There we go, okay. So the main reason why I think that sociologists of punishment need to explicitly incorporate and address the punishment of sexual violence in our sociological analyses is that, at least in the Anglophone and Global North jurisdictions with which I'm most familiar, and I'd be interested to hear later if this is the case across the rest of the world as well, but at least in these jurisdictions, people convicted of sex offences are a major and growing target of the penal state. So in England and Wales, which is my jurisdiction, people convicted of sex offences currently make up 21% of the prison population. And this is a really massive growth over the last few decades. It was 4% in 1980, and it's kind of gone up since then. And numerically, at least, this is one driver, not necessarily the biggest driver or the main driver, but one driver of the overall increase in the prison population that we've seen over the same period. But one which I don't think has been sufficiently addressed or included in accounts of the growth of mass incarceration. And it's also possible that, in addition to there being a numeric, to the increasing kind of focus on punishing this group, numerically increasing the prison population, that it may have also affected modern penal systems in other ways. So a really common criticism of what's called carceral feminism, which is the umbrella term which opponents give to the feminist strategy of trying to reduce gender-based and sexual violence through the penal system. A common critique of that is that the reforms it brings in to try and increase convictions for and the regulation of gender-based and sexual violence end up catching other people in their net. So one of the examples that is often given is mandatory arrests in the US for domestic violence, ending up leading to massive increase in arrests of women, for example. And I don't think that it's necessarily been convincingly proven that that attempts by feminists to increase the punishment of sexual offending does straightforwardly loop people in all the time, that always other people are getting caught up. But I think it's an interesting question for sociologists to address. And I think it's also worth noticing that not only are people convicted of sex offences currently a massive target of the penal state, they're likely over the next few years, I think, to become even more of a kind of focus for punishment. So there is an explicit plan for the explicit goal in many countries, mine own included, is to increase the rate of convictions in cases of sexual violence, for example. That will have an impact on the prison population. And also currently in England and Wales, maybe I'm being optimistic, but it's possible that we're currently on the precipice of, if not decarceration, then at least a kind of delay in penal expansion. And that is likely to exclude people convicted of sex offences. So there's for those who may not be aware, the Labour government recently introduced a new plan to release people who have served 40% of their sentence. Normally people are released at 50%, but they're bringing it down to 40 because there are literally not enough spaces in the prison system. But they're deliberately excluding people convicted of domestic, sexual and other serious violence from this. And so it is likely, I think, over the next few years that the proportion is going to go up. And in other countries, attempts to decarcerate have also led to an increase in the proportion of people convicted of sex offences in the prison population. So in Norway, for example, the prison population has massively dropped over the last kind of 5 or 6 years. It's gone down by about 25%, which is quite significant. And there's lots of reasons for that. But one is the increasing use of electronic monitoring. People convicted of sex offences and violent offences are excluded from that. They're not eligible to apply for electronic monitoring. In the vast majority of cases at least, which means that they've proportionately become a much greater focus of the prison population. So it's now 24% of the prison population in Norway. So I think what we're seeing is a shift in the prison population environment where it's becoming increasingly focused on targeting gender-based and sexual violence. And despite the significance of this group as a particular target of penal systems, I think the research that has been conducted within the kind of prisons and punishment world on this group often tends to be a little bit separate from work in the rest of the field. So I think it's normally seen as work on sex offenders rather than work on punishment. And in particular, the work that does exist is often, not always, but often correctional in its intention. So whether implicitly or explicitly, it's kind of often assumed that work on the punishment of people convicted of sex offences is primarily about whether or not that punishment contributes to reduced reoffending or rehabilitation, and so on. And I don't want to discredit that work at all. Obviously, I think it's very important. I've done some of it myself. But I also think it's important to study the punishment of sexual offending as a form of punishment. And I think our reluctance to do so prevents us from asking some hard questions about punishment, about the desire to punish, about who we punish and why we punish. I think it's a mistake to base our criticisms of mass incarceration purely on its most ideal victims. So if one driver of mass incarceration, just one, but still one driver of mass incarceration, is a state which is taking sexual violence more seriously and which is seeing it as its business and therefore choosing to express this by punishing it more seriously, what challenges does this raise for our critique of mass incarceration? Does it change how we think about the desire for punishment in general if the target of such punishment is increasingly those who commit gender-based and sexual violence? Does it make it harder for us to explain away the desire for punishment as sort of discreditable punitiveness that is distasteful to experience if the people involved are convicted of sexual offences? I think we need to kind of keep questioning our impulses here. And there's a third reason, though, why I think it's worthwhile to study the punishment of people convicted of sex offences. And that's because I think it functions as a sort of ideal type in the Weberian sense. So I don't think it's a form of punishment that is the same as or that represents all other forms of punishment. I don't think it's, all forms of punishment are identical. But I do think it accentuates and synthesises some of its key characteristics and brings them into the fore in a way which makes it a really useful and revealing case study of certain penal dynamics. So in the next part of the talk, I'm hoping to illustrate that a bit by drawing on some work I've conducted with my colleagues Ben Crew, Christian Muirland, Julie Larson and Anna Schlier. And this was work that we conducted on a large-scale project on penal policymaking and the prisoner experience in England and Wales and Norway. It was led by Ben Crew and based at Cambridge University. I think the fieldwork was conducted between something like 2016 and 2019, I think. And the project was intended as a sort of empirical test of the Scandinavian exceptionalism thesis. So the Scandinavian exceptionalism thesis is the idea that Scandinavian countries or Nordic countries, these are slightly different terms, but those countries are, unusually mild and liberal in their punishment practices. And our goal was to kind of look at, is that the case on the ground? If you look below imprisonment rates, to look at lived experience in punishment. So we're thinking about what is it like to be in prison in a neoliberal, exclusionary, high punishment country like England and Wales, versus what is it like to be in prison in a social democratic, inclusionary, low punishment country like Norway. And there were lots of different sub-studies to this project. It was absolutely enormous. But one thread which ran through it was a deliberate attempt to focus on the punishment of primarily men convicted of sex offences in both countries. And just generally, when we're talking about people convicted of sex offences in prison, in the vast majority of cases, we're talking about men. So what I'm going to say in this kind of middle section of the talk is partly, but not exclusively, drawn from an article that I wrote with my colleague Christian Muirland, screenshot of which is on the screen, that we wrote together about sexual violence, the punishment of sexual violence in the two countries, and which came out a couple of years ago. But there's also some new stuff in here which kind of builds on and develops the argument a bit, just in case anyone's already read it. I promise there'll be something new. So I'm not going to explain the sample in too much detail because it would take ages. I'm happy to go into more detail in questions at the end if anyone would like me to. The crucial things to note is that the analysis I'm going to talk about is drawn on 132 interviews overall. These were with men in prison for sexual offences in both countries. Most of the interviews were conducted inside prisons, in multiple different prisons in each country, but a small number were conducted outside prison. So we interviewed 10 men convicted of sex offences outside prison in shortly after their release in England and Wales, and 7 in Norway. And it's also just worth noting that at the time we conducted the fieldwork, so the fieldwork for this project ended in 2018, I think. At that time, the countries had very different overall imprisonment rates. So in Norway, there were about 65 people in prison for every 100,000 in their population. In England and Wales, there were 142 people in prison for every 100,000 in their population. So that's an overall imprisonment rate, which is almost twice as high. But the proportion of these men who were in for sexual offences was exactly the same at that period of time. So 18% of all people were in prison for sexual offences in 2018. It's since gone up in both countries and even more so in Norway. And given these similar proportions, what we were interested in was more the quality of punishment. What's it like to be in prison and to be punished as someone convicted of a sex offence in these countries, rather than the quantity of punishment? So what characterised it? And what we found was that the punishment of men convicted of sex offences in England and Wales was marked by what we called authoritarian exclusion. So mirroring Loic Wachont's description of the neoliberal state as a centaur state, so something which is loose and liberal for those at the top and tight and restrictive for those at the bottom, we found that the penal state in England and Wales imposed tight restrictions on people convicted of sex offences in a way that actively and deliberately served to block their reincorporation as citizens at the end of their punishment. In Norway, on the other hand, the punishment represented a sort of laissez-faire inclusion. And I use the term laissez-faire here in a way which both reflects a respect for individual autonomy and individual rights, but which also implies an apparent carelessness. So we found a state in Norway which operated with a surprisingly light touch. And this wasn't what we were expecting. Often critiques of the Nordic states imply that they are extremely invasive and intrusive in the way that they use power, but this wasn't what we found. We found a state that rarely imposed legal or other burdens on people convicted of sex offences, in addition to their prison sentence, of course, but which also rarely worked against other processes of exclusion. And I just want to state here that the words inclusion and exclusion, I think, are extremely morally weighted, and I'm not intending to use them in a moralized way here. I don't want to imply that one is better than the other. I just kind of wanted to get that on the record. So this grid is obviously a little complicated. I'm not going to go into a vast amount of detail, but in the overall article, what we try to do is describe different aspects of the punishment experience using the primarily, but not exclusively, the 4 forms of rehabilitation developed by Fergus MacNeill. And we use this as a way of trying to describe what each state does and does not do to either loop people in to include them or to push people away to exclude them. I'm not going to go through this all today because there's not time, but what I do want to do is talk about what we thought were the 2 most significant factors which distinguished the 2 penal cultures, but which also showed some of the similarities between them. So the first was the extent to which they characterised people convicted of sex offences as a fundamentally different type of person, the sex offender. And the second was the different legal statuses of people convicted of sex offences after they were released. So in England and Wales, prisoners convicted of sex offences are treated as a fundamentally different type of person to other prisoners, the sex offender. This sex offender term has historically been used at many levels of the penal system, in policy documents, by prison managers, by prison staff. And although there is a bit of a top-down move away from this label, so it's not the dumb terminology anymore to use the word sex offender. People try to use people convicted of sex offences, or sometimes the acronym PCOSOs. Despite the move away from the linguistic label, the idea that this is a separate kind of type of person persists. And because they're believed to be a separate type of person who are specifically dangerous, they're subjected to different types of offence-specific forms of risk assessment, regulation, and treatment. After release, different types of licence restrictions are imposed on them, and they're also subjected to specific forms of management known as the Sex Offenders Register. This is a bit different to the one in the US. It's not publicly available in the same way, but it still exists. And crucially also, in men's prisons in England and Wales, they are held separately from other prisoners. Other prisoners are kind of often known as mainstream prisoners. And people convicted of sex offences are held either in specialist units within mainstream prisons or in prisons which are just for people convicted of sex offences. There's around 8 prisons just for men convicted of sex offences in England and Wales. It could be 1 or 2 higher, it could be 1 or 2 lower. In Norway, on the other hand, prison workers and managers try to avoid defining people by their offences. They don't subject people to additional forms of restrictions, as they, on the whole, try to resist seeing them as categorically different. Prison allocation is not done on the basis of offence. So most people convicted of sex offences are held alongside mainstream prisoners, and most forms of risk assessment and regulation are either shared by all prisoners or imposed on an individualised and discretionary basis rather than a categorical one. So here we see a top-down process of exclusion in England and Wales. People convicted of sex offences are seen as fundamentally different and seen as deserving of additional treatment and constructed in a way which furthers the idea that they are different. And a top-down attempt at inclusion in Norway, the opposite is happening. But the reality on the ground, the kind of bottom-up processes, was a bit more complicated than that. So first, the fact that people were held in integrated prisons in Norway put many prisoners convicted of sex offences at physical risk from other prisoners. While explicit physical violence seemed rare, the risk of it was very much present. Many people convicted of sex offences described being frozen out or bullied as a result of their offences, and many spent a lot of time alone in their rooms to avoid the risk of physical violence. And this pattern has been found in similar countries which don't hold people convicted of sex offences separately. So Frederick Taxhjelm, that's not exactly how I pronounce it, I think, so apologies if you're here, Frederick, for not saying your name quite right, but Frederick Taxhjelm is a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen working on voluntary isolation. And he's found that in Danish prisons, at least 20% of the people who are voluntarily isolating themselves are serving a sentence for a sex offence, and so doing it to keep safe. So on the one hand, this kind of top-down attempt at inclusion in Norway is met by resistance from the ground up. And indeed, it's clear that in both countries, in both England and Wales and in Norway, prisoners convicted of all different types of offences tended to believe that sex offenders were a fundamentally different type of person than mainstream prisoners or criminals. So from the ground up, there is a belief in this kind of categorical difference. And you can see some of that in the quotes on the slide. Bertram, serving a sentence for a child sex offence in Norway, says that he and other people like him are normal people who've led normal lives, unlike criminals. Carlton, serving a sentence for rape in England and Wales, says people in his prison, which is just for people convicted of sex offences, aren't criminals, they're teachers, they're doctors, and so on. And from the way people talked about these categories, it was clear that there was more to them than just what people were convicted of. Across both countries, prisoners with different types of offences distinguished the categories quite consistently by three key characteristics. First was the presumed harm caused by the offence. Second was the presumed permanence of the offending behaviour. So sexual, and I think the direction of that varied depending on what people were themselves convicted of on the whole. But they pretty also consistently distinguished these harms on the basis of class. So whereas people thought that criminals were from the streets, in AJ's words, and were compelled by their backgrounds, by financial reality, by hypermasculine toughness, by whatever it is, by whatever the kind of stereotype you want to draw on, to continue to offend indiscriminately, sex offenders tended to be imagined as middle-class, professional, white, and as only offending in a specific subsphere. So they weren't generalists, they were specialists. And I think it's really interesting that this distinction pertained both in class-obsessed neoliberal exclusionary England and Wales, where in England and Wales, we love to make judgments based on class, but also in welfarist, inclusionary, and supposedly egalitarian Norway. And I think the persistence of this distinction tells us two things about punishment, both of which I'm going to return to a bit at the end. So firstly, it just reminds us of the significance of class to processes of imprisonment and criminalisation, even if they take quite complicated forms when it comes to the punishment of people convicted of sex offences. And second, it reminds us that top-down attempts at inclusion are not enough if there is still bottom-up processes of exclusion. In other words, we want to understand how penality works. We need to understand it at the level of the community, whether the community inside prison or outside prison, as well as the level of the state. Okay, so that's one of the two factors distinguishing the penal systems. The other factor distinguishing them that I wanted to talk about today was the legal status of people convicted of sex offences after their release. So this is the form of, in the words of the article that some of this work is in, this is the form of legal or judicial rehabilitation applied to people after their release. And this is a term defined by Fergus McNeill as when, how, and to what extent a criminal record and the stigma it represents can ever be set aside, sealed, or surpassed. Is it possible for people to move on from their requalified legal status as a prisoner or as someone who's committed an offence after they get out or not? And what we found was, perhaps unsurprisingly, that exclusionary England and Wales was actively de-habilitative. Everyone convicted of a sex offence was requalified as a particular type of legal subject with a particular additional legal burdens. So everyone released from prison after serving for a sex offence goes on the sex offenders register. If you've served more than 30 months, you'll go on the register for life. Everyone also faces many other tight and legally enforced restrictions on their behaviour, which will normally have an endpoint. These types of restrictions will vary, but really common restrictions, depending on the offence, will include no contact with anyone under 18. That might be no unsupervised contact, but that might be no supervised contact with anyone under 18, or it might be no access to the internet, for example. But actually, in practice, the way these legal restrictions affected people's lives were complex. When we interview people in prison, and the majority of our interviews were while people were in prison, people in England and Wales were really preoccupied by the limited future they thought was going to be available for them, even more so than other prisoners were. But once we interviewed them when they were out, we found that many men found that the effects of these legal requalifications weren't as bad as the nightmarish version they had feared, at least practically. So they involved them having to do less than they thought they might. So Luca, for example, described signing the sex offenders register as just a layer of administration. Russ said his licence restrictions didn't stop him doing anything. These varied a bit depending on what the restrictions were. So Joel, for example, talked about how difficult it was to build a social life when you weren't allowed any even supervised contact with anyone under 18. But on the whole, people didn't find the restrictions as bad as they had feared they were going to. However, while people on the whole didn't feel that they had much to do as much or to limit their behaviour as much as they had feared they might, they still felt that the penal state was operating them and this legal requalification was affecting them by making their criminal conviction visible. So it had a kind of maloptical effect, to use Fergus McNeill's terms again. I feel like I'm using a lot of Fergus's conceptualisation here. So signing the sex offenders register, for instance, might not have had as many practical difficulties as people had feared, but it did have morally communicative or symbolic effects. It kicks you out, you down, it makes you feel like a bogeyman or whatever. And the state also didn't just make people's convictions visible to themselves, didn't just remind them of their own criminal convictions, it also compelled them to disclose their convictions, to make them visible to other people. So people had to disclose their convictions when they started new romantic relationships, which often kind of put them off starting them, or when applying for jobs and so on. And sometimes this disclosure wasn't actually something which the state compelled, was an accidental byproduct of state actions. So Harry, in the quote at the bottom, describes finally finding a new flat after looking for a flat for ages. And then the police officer who's supervising him because of him being on the sex offenders register comes to inspect the flat, which is a standard part of the process. And then the landlady is there. At the point the police officer looks around, landlady finds out he's on the sex offenders register and he gets kicked out. So what we see in the dynamics of disclosure is the effects of punishment, the material effects of punishment, being determined by quite complex relationships between state practices and community responses. The state is legally requalifying people in a way which means that their criminal convictions have to be known, have to be declared, but the material effect that has on people's lives is determined not by the state, but by members of the community. To turn to legal status after release, though, we see quite a different picture, although one which has echoes. So participants in Norway were, on the whole, legally rehabilitated. They were not subject, just as they were not constructed as a fundamentally different type of person within prison, they also were not legally requalified after their imprisonment, or at least not to the same extent. There is no sex offenders register in Norway. And while sometimes post-release restrictions are imposed, many people are released without any sort of post-release restrictions. And those that are given out are imposed on an individualised and discretionary basis. So Julius, quoted on this slide, served several years in prison for having a sexual relationship with a girl under the age of 16. He was released early, which is something you can apply for in Norway, with no restrictions imposed on him at all. So he said, normally when people get out, you have to meet with the prison and probation service, but because of my behaviour in prison and because of the support system around me, they didn't think it necessary in my case. And when people did have restrictions in Norway, they were rarely described as burdensome. So they would include things like seeing your probation officer every week or every month, seeing your therapist every so often, and things like that. And enforced disclosure was also something that wasn't really on people's radar, at least with the exception of a small number of jobs which you weren't allowed to access, but it wasn't a kind of standardized and imposed phenomenon in the same way. However, I'm going to go back actually. But despite this lack of authoritarian intervention on the part of the states, we see the state here trying not to see people as fundamentally different types of people. In practice, people in Norway who we interviewed after their release were often experiencing quite a fugitive or fragile form of inclusion. Just to give one example, Bertram, who I think we quoted earlier, was convicted of sexual offences against his daughters. And we interviewed him shortly before his release when he was arranging moving to a rural area because he had been facing harassment and death threats, and he anticipated doing so on his release. And what was key to him was that he was living somewhere where if he needed to move house to escape the abuse that he was anticipating, he would still be able to work. So we here see kind of the limits of the state's inclusionary capacities, as despite its attempts at legal requalification, it's unable to counteract the kind of bottom-up processes of civil society. This is one reason that we called this form of inclusion laissez-faire. And the other reason we called this form of punishment laissez-faire is because of the way it operates on individuals, and the fact that although people are formally requalified and formally told that their punishment is over, they don't necessarily feel that their punishment is over. And this is because of the ritualistic function of punishment, which imprisonment often performs really poorly, even in Norway. So the decent quality of living conditions in Norway and the lack of harsh conditions after release meant that people who'd even served quite a significant period of time in Norway, and by significant I don't mean years and years and years, but a year or so, often felt that their imprisonment wasn't that much more than a sort of benign storage. People would talk about it as nothing, a blip, 4 months of my life, that type of thing. But they rarely described it as something which was emotionally significant or meaningful. And this lengthy quote on the slide is an illustration of this. So Petter was a man who went to prison for several months for sending indecent images of himself to an underage girl. Prior to his conviction, he'd had a kind of professional job, he had friends and family, he was kind of doing very well, but then committed this crime, went to prison. During his sentence, he didn't receive any psychological treatment of any type. He didn't discuss his offence with anyone. He didn't discuss why he did it. He did his few-month sentence. He got out with no restrictions on his behaviour. He continued to struggle with feelings of guilt and shame. And he also had the lingering fear that he might have some sort of sexual problem. At no point had anyone discussed with him why he had done this and whether he might do it again. And he said that the sentence had not helped him to feel like he had paid his debt or moved on with it. So he felt legally requalified. He was legally done with the case. It's like a debt, you've paid your debt and your debt is done. But he didn't feel like that is what you feel yourself. If you really feel sorry for what you did, I don't think that's what you get through being in prison. So in this quote, I think Petter illustrates some of the limitations of legal rehabilitation as something which can facilitate inclusion. So he regains his rights through his sentence. He's not released as a subject without rights or with additional burdens, and that matters, but it's not the same as paying your dues or fixing the harm. And he describes Norway's formally inclusionary system as insufficiently active to serve as a meaningful ritual, another reason why we considered it to be laissez-faire. Okay. So I'm just briefly going to say, I've described a bit these two systems of punishment in the two countries and drawn attention to some of the similarities and differences. I'm going to zoom up slightly because I've taken slightly longer than I intended, but I just want to return to my argument that the punishment of men convicted of sex offences represents a sort of ideal type of punishment. And I think this comparison draws our attention to four key aspects of punishment. The first is the complicated ways it varies internationally, some of which haven't been described. So this idea of Norwegian inclusion as less invasive or laissez-faire has not previously been accounted for in the literature, for example. I also think this comparison draws attention to the complicated relationships between the community and the state and dynamics of punishment. It indicates the importance of ritualistic and emotional dimensions of punishment and the fact that punishments can mean too little as well as too much. And it also draws our attention to dynamics of class and how much we have naturalized assumptions about the class backgrounds of prisoners. So I'm just going to end, if I may, before questions, back where I started, which is by explicitly calling for more sociological attention to the punishment of men convicted of sex offences, and by suggesting some questions that I think could guide this work. So some questions that I think it would be interesting or useful for the field to answer are: to what extent and how has the increasing punishment of sexual violence driven penal change? So numerically across the world, but also in terms of introducing new penal strategies that may or may not loop other people into the system. What are the main political, economic, cultural and emotional drivers of the punishment of sexual violence? And are they different than the punishment of other forms of violence? Is this a different punishment with different causes or the same causes? Where does race and class fit in? Is the imprisonment of men convicted of sex offences less disproportionate? And what does this do to our criticisms of the criminal justice system as something that operates along and enhances indices of inequality? Does the punishment of men convicted of sex offences or people convicted of sex offences have the same individual and societal effects as other forms of punishment? What intersecting roles do the community and the state play in such punishment, both in shaping what it's like in custody, and in shaping its long afterlife? And also, how and why does the punishment of people convicted of sex offences vary between countries? And in particular, does it vary alongside the traditional dimensions like welfare spending or political culture and so on? So I'm going to leave you with those questions, I think, yeah, stop sharing my screen.